And obviously, I don't need to tell this group about the changing global pressures that both oceans and inland lakes habitat changes are taking place, overexploitation, and with these changes in migration patterns and movements and survival of animals are happening. And it continues to be really difficult, as you all know, to get information about animals that live below the surface. And so sustainable use of our aquatic ecosystems will absolutely depend on a better understanding globally of what's going on with the ecosystems and both natural forcing and human impacts. So we can't do this from localized regions. We can only do this from recognizing that we are interconnected globally. And so what is OTN? In case any of you don't know, it is a global-led research consortium. It's headquartered at Dalhousie University in Canada, but it is global in principle. And it was spearheaded by $45 million contribution from the Canadian government, but to establish these acoustic curtain technology across all continents. And together with our international partners, it started out as something like a $168 million project. And the core focus has been in North America, but we are increasingly extending to the international community. And in fact, it's a real priority for OTN. And just so that you understand what the current funding structure is that $35 million came from the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, CFI, and that was to establish the global infrastructure, that is to put the receivers in place. And then $10 million came from NSERC, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, to fund the Canadian-led research program that makes use of that infrastructure in Canada. But a priority for both OTN Canada and Global is to extend this funding. Right now it goes through 2017, and to extend it as a long-term permanent global observing system, the only observing system that's really focused, instead of measuring ocean characteristics, but on animal movement. And I have to leave at noon today, but if you have some other questions, Steve Cook is the chair of the OTN Canada Scientific Advisory Committee and also is on the International Scientific Advisory Committee, so he can answer some questions. And of course, you know what things are based on. You're using the same kind of things in GLaTOS. But with OTN, it's the real emphasis is to establish a global network of users using a common database, and to demonstrate technologies that couple animal movements and locations with changing environmental conditions. Now I'm pretty sure most of you are using all VR2s. We of course use the same things. We have these receivers that tagged animals are tracking, and we can bring the receivers up and get the data. We're also, in collaboration with VEMCO, they developed a receiver which we can actually query by either moving a glider over it or a ship or even satellite, to actually not remove the receiver but to collect the data just by moving over top of it. We have gliders, ocean gliders going, and finally we are now using large animal predators to carry receiver-like devices, which I'll describe in a minute, to act as roving receivers. And so right now we have, this simply shows you the current OTN-sponsored coverage in blue, and then some of the future coverage in red, and these are deployments, and in fact this shows St. Mary's River, but we've also, we've also are considering a proposal right now to establish another 45 receivers in Lake Erie in collaboration with GLaTOS. And then the greens are data partners, so these are people that aren't actually getting receivers from us, but are actually sharing data. And then finally the yellow are known acoustic tracking areas that could, and hopefully will, become data partners. So I want to go through sort of the mission of OTN, the policies that are in place. I'm not going to have to go through too much on the data sheet template since Chris has already talked about that, but a little bit about the data warehouse and metadata and other standard web services. But the one thing I want to emphasize is that OTN has now been selected as the basis for the new US IUCE Animal Tracking Data Exchange Standard. And in fact, the director of IUCE is a member of the OTN Council, so is very much online with this. And in fact, we are now trying to get the U.S. Animal Tracking Network involved as well. And so the vision of OTN is to enable international sustainable management of valued aquatic species by providing knowledge of animal movement, survival, and habitats, and how all these are linked with changing conditions, and to foster technological and operational innovation that will revolutionize the management of our ecosystems. And to do this, we aim to create a global partnership to construct and sustain a scientific platform and the associated trained personnel to collect, store, share, analyze, and use aquatic tracking and environmental data to support sustainable management of our oceans and inland waters. Now we've gone over the OECD principles, which the principles are to develop policies covering responsibilities of various parties involved, negotiating data sharing arrangements, rewarding initial contributors with temporary exclusive use of data, developing secure systems, and being very explicit about standards and promoting the most advanced practices. Now, in Canada in 2011, we also faced some new funding challenges, which was all the major granting councils in Canada came together and with a consensus that all data from publicly funded research has to be made openly available in a timely manner, whatever that means, as a condition of the funding. And that's certainly a condition of our CFI and NSERC funding. They haven't worked out the exact details yet. They're still undergoing this. But some of the kinds of limitations, and we place restrictions, you guys have based, well, POST was the forerunner. We have now sort of taken over POST because POST no longer exists, so we've taken over the infrastructure and have all the data. But we have restrictions on when data is released, just like GLaDOS does. But also, some of the total limitations would be not reporting location of or information on endangered species as a means of protecting them from illegal harvest, or protecting thesis data of what we call highly qualified personnel, that HQP. That means in Canada that it's the lingo for all graduate students, postdocs, etc. And these would obviously last longer than a normal, say, 2-year period. So some more of the data challenges are that the metadata and data are obtained from the most authoritative sources, and that's including instrument specifications and calibrations, that the tag release and metadata are secured before the detection data are dispersed to trackers in order to really make this system work, and to assure that all metadata and data are secure before major scientific achievements and publicly announced and new funds are allocated to researchers, and identifying publications from generated data. And Chris has already covered a few of these. We know about some of these tags, these mystery tags. We know that tags and receivers are operated by different institutions and individuals, and there are different specifications. And so these often represent a challenge, but we are trying to work together to at least allow people to know what's out there and what can possibly be used. And so there is an OTN data policy. It's probably very similar to what's GLaDOS using, which has specific definitions, policies about what is restricted data and what is unrestricted data. The unrestricted data is generally limited to static data, where the receivers are, what species have been tagged. The restricted data are the data that are coming in real time, the tracking data that belong to the investigator and cannot be released for, I think the default is 2 years, until giving them such time to publish those results, and these can be extended, at which point they become available to other members of the network, not to the public, but basically that means that we can work with one another's data, and we're not reinventing the wheel by doing one small piece of research in our area. And then assuring sustainability and availability of the data, and finally making sure that everything is properly acknowledged. And a lot of this came based on the Australian Acoustic Tracking and Monitoring System and POST, of course, and some of the policies of DFO. Chris went over datasheet templates. There are a number of them that can be found on the OTN website. And one of the things that I would reiterate is that even though the templates are there, and I think Chris also said this, there's a lot more fields than you might be able to fill out or willing to fill out. Anything, even as a template, is better than nothing. And the metadata is really important because at least it gives people the idea, even if the data aren't there, the individual investigator can say, oh, this person is studying the same species, but over here I can contact that person and ask them what they're doing, and could we possibly collaborate or share data in the future. OTN is based and works very hard on maintaining a secure data warehouse, and the collaborators' data are stored in a user ID framework. Collaborators can be a deployment collaborator, meaning OTN has provided equipment to these people, and therefore we really are both a data collaborator and a deployment collaborator, a tracking collaborator, or just a data collaborator, which at this point may be most of you, although some of you who are applying to OTN for some receivers to be put in the Great Lakes would certainly be a deployment collaborator. And we are operating under the International Oceanographic Data Information Exchange policies, building long-term sustainability and global accessibility. Now, the one thing is, I say this, I may describe this global database that we envision and already are implementing, but really the best nodes are that the local investigators, the local networks, are actually controlling the QA and the QC. And then OTN then builds these into the global database by linking into that OTN node. And so, in fact, GLaDOS, for instance, would still be the network that it is, but it could be then linked into the global network so that without reinventing the wheel, GLaDOS could be linked in globally, really fairly quickly. And this can be done starting on an individual basis and adopted later by the network. And the real benefit comes from being able to make use from really extensive controlled quality data warehousing and management capabilities that are funded through OTN, having access to metadata and eventually to detailed data that puts the data into much larger frameworks. And these are going to be more and more important as we go along with changing climate. We have transboundary species. We need to know what's going on in other regions. And certainly we want to link these with other oceanographic and environmental data. And that's one of the other missions of OTN is to really engage the oceanographers or the ecosystem folks really strongly with the animal movement data so that we are not working in a box. And so basically again, there is totally controlled access to private data products, but the OTN discovery metadata are hyperlinked. And so people can see what's going on and who's using what kinds of, who's tagging what where and who's using what kind of techniques. And so those are the free and open access to public data products. But only members can then get to another level of restricted data. But again, the PI owns their own tracking data for several years. Now, another thing that obviously everybody here is extremely interested in is data visualization and analysis. And to assure that it's authoritative, discoverable, accessible, and interoperable. And we all have the same kinds of issues of trying to use tracking data and being able to visualize and analyze it better. And so I want to just speak for a few minutes about the data visualization and analysis team that we are building, which we view as an international effort. We have already sort of begun, but we're starting in sort of phase 2 of OTN Canada, and part of that is we're seeking funding to bring international researchers in for a collaborative effort to really build what we're calling a data visualization and analysis team. And this is to develop the tools that everyone needs, to develop the modeling tools necessary to analyze tracking studies with particular emphasis on estimating migration and survival of species in relationship to changing environments. And one of the missions is also to create a repository of documented shared code and freely available software. One of the plans is to start creating some R packages that could be available either to to both OTN researchers and publicly available that would be on the website. And that's one of the missions we would like to start working on right away. And then finally, or perhaps not finally, but a large emphasis is the exchange of HQP, that is postdocs, graduate students, between arenas and regions, both nationally and internationally, to foster stronger collaboration, again, so that we're not all reinventing the wheels in our own corners. And obviously part of this will be an ongoing strategic planning and funding activities as we go forward. Now I just want to show a few examples that might be relevant to GLaDOS, the kinds of things that we're doing in your backyard, actually, as it were. Steve mentioned Julian Dodson, who has receivers in the St. Lawrence. Catadromous eels obviously perform this huge migration somewhere to the Sargasso Sea to spawn, and then there's larval drift back to the continental waters, and then a period of growth, and then return somewhere to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. The populations have experienced dramatic declines and are variously endangered or at risk. And so the question we had as part of OTN Canada, and this is Julian's work, is to establish the migration routes in this, first to do that in the St. Lawrence system, and to try and identify the conditions that they encounter on these pathways. So we set up a number of MCO receivers along the St. Lawrence, and if you could click on this, this just shows that we've finally begun to establish the migration routes of the eels as they move out of the St. Lawrence and out into the Atlantic Ocean. However, here they stopped, and there's another fixed line there, but basically most of the tags stopped there. And so eels were fitted with these pop-up satellite tags, and sure enough, it turns out that because of where these tags popped up, the temperature profiles that they had recorded, it had to have been an endothermic tuna or shark, and by process of other kinds of elimination, we determined that it must be the porbeagle shark, and we've identified a new predation. And so this shows an example of combining a couple techniques with not just acoustic telemetry. We're also studying Atlantic sturgeon, which have experienced huge historical declines and are undergoing the same kind of pressures that they are in the lakes due to fishing, but also tidal power plants that are being put in place. And so this is just an example of some of the early data that we've just started to get from sturgeon. Each of these dots is an individual sturgeon moving up and down the St. John River as the date goes by in the summer. And what we're doing is we're going to be able to use this to try and understand where animals are going and moving in the river so that we can better inform fisheries practices, and also looking at these both before and after the implement of tidal power plants to look at the effects of human impacts. And so these are the kinds of data that could certainly be of use to linking between GLaDOS and OTN. And now the migrations, they will be migrating off to sea, and their returns to the river that will be documented. And survival is being studied and conditioned, et cetera. Now one other example is that, and this is going to go really fast, but we're trying to develop some more, before we get into we have some really good modelers working with us, but we're trying to look at some of the visualization capacities. This happens to be the seal we're tracking, and the red is females and the blue is males, but this is basically 100 days plus or minus in the life of an aquatic predator if you want to just click on it. But each of these is a single day's movement of these guys. And so we're beginning to get a much better sense of how quickly and where they're using the ocean. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about too is that there is another receiver that VEMCO is now making, and they did this in collaboration particularly with the SEAL study, but this is called a VEMCO mobile transceiver. And what it is it's a miniature receiver and transmitter. It acts as the same thing that can be put on in an animal that's large enough to carry it. So for instance, a sturgeon, and that's our next step, but right now we were using the seals as an example. But basically, that animal, if it crosses an acoustic array, will be detected because it's transmitting, but it will also receive any transmitter from for instance, that seal, or from carrying another VMT, or from any fish that's tagged swimming by it. So it allows us to begin studying predator-prey interactions. And if we have satellite GPS linked with it, we can tell when and where these interactions are taking place. And so this is just an example of the first prototype of the VMT that was put on the back of the seal, and then some COD deployments that we were putting in. And what we've been able to do is through this is we've modeled fast and slow movements of these animals, slow movements equating to search-restricted foraging behavior, so where they really are stopping to slow down. And these are in the black, but they're sort of hidden there. But if you see the little red dots here and here, that's where most of the seal encounters are occurring, and we believe these are indicating the foraging hotspots that are on these shallow offshore banks. And then as a last example, we now are beginning to use these roaming receivers to act as roaming receivers where we don't have fixed arrays. So for instance, we had salmon tagged here in rivers here and here, and seals swimming around, detected them out here and here at various time points. Bluefin tuna was tagged here, was detected by one seal here. The same tuna was detected by another seal a year later up here. And then cod had been tagged here and began to be detected by seals there and there. And the point is, we're beginning to get some detections of things like migrating Atlantic salmon out of the rivers that we, in areas and times that we wouldn't have known, and in areas where fixed arrays aren't present. And so the next generation of the VMT, which we're working closely with VEMCO, will be an integrated tag that can upload to a satellite and will allow us to put these kinds of tags on other aquatic animals that are large enough to carry them, sturgeon, etc. In the Arctic, people are using the VMTs as a fixed receiver in areas where it might be difficult to put another receiver. And we will be able to get real-time upload of data. And so why GLaDOS would collaborate with OTN? OTN has data that could be of great use to GLaDOS and vice versa. GLaDOS could link via a compatible node. GLaDOS still has a locally owned network. And the point is, fish move, and they're moving more. We know that. And examples are American eels, lampreys, invasive species, transboundary species, sturgeon. There are temporal changes in movement patterns that if we don't extend to who's studying them elsewhere, we may not get the whole piece of the puzzle. We all know about mystery tags and the ability to be able to figure out who those tags are if we have a global database. The government is requiring, granting councils are more and more requiring that there's public or other access to data. And the point is that detections are not reported, they're reported to the PIs, not to the public, just as the GLaDOS system is set up. But the metadata available allows all interested parties to at least initially contact PIs to find out what they're doing. And then obviously we're all sharing techniques and expertise and common data analysis tools. And I guess finally, it's hard and it's expensive. And so the more that we can collaborate with one another and maybe piggyback off one another with receivers or arrays or studies, and certainly, kinds of the data visualization tools that we're building, it's really important. And I'll go back to that last point in a minute. Current status, we have over 15 countries involved, more than 71 institutions, 15 ocean regions, and getting close to 200 projects. So you can imagine the kind of information that is out there. And finally, we are linking externally to the oceanographic data and biological data. And I think I will close by simply saying we're working to make the world's aquatic and ocean tracking data and related information freely accessible without charge to the broader scientific community. And in doing this, really helping to lead the transformation of tracking aquatic animals. And I just want to add that through some of this, particularly the data visualization and analysis tools, we're beginning to host some workshops that we would be really interested in having some GLaDOS participation in if there are people that are really keen on this. One of the first ones will be this June, but it would be really great if you could contact me if you're interested, and otherwise if you're really interested in the specifics of some of the data, the actual database and the managers of that, I can also give you that information. So I will end there and take any questions.